As the League of Legends World Championship draws closer, we're starting to see a lot of big figures in the scene make really cool content, like Jat, Deficio, and Spawn's top 20 players list, etc., etc. And we're getting a lot of comments on places like Reddit and Twitter that effectively boil down to Analyst X only said that because he doesn't watch enough Region Y. Or Analyst X only said that because he fanboys Region Z or Player A. And that's why I thought it was a good time to talk about a concept called regional loyalty in League of Legends analysis. And obviously, some of you will know that this is something that hits close to home for me, but I just wanted to talk about a more broad overview and then a few things that people may have overlooked when you talk about it, and some of the values and some of the flaws inherent within the system. So first, defining regional loyalty. Regional loyalty occurs when someone who watches a game critically over and over again and tries to kind of explain what teams are doing or what they're doing well or what they're doing wrong and critically assess these teams, watches specifically a lot of regions games, either the EULCS, the NALCS, the LCK, the LPL, the LMS, or another wildcard region. And the reason this starts to happen, especially with casters, is if you are casting a lot of games, you really need to be able to impart insight about a specific team really well that you gain from watching a lot of the games, watching them play against teams within their own region, understanding the regional meta, why specific teams do specific things in a certain area that they might not in another. A good example of kind of a regional meta difference is in Europe, you don't see bottom lanes doing camps as much, and there are some really interesting reasons for this, but someone who watches a lot of LPL or some other region might watch the ULCS and say, why aren't their bot lanes starting camps? Like, they're missing an opportunity to get a level advantage over their opponent. But the EULCS teams actually have like really good reasons and really good ideas behind why you shouldn't just start camp every game for your bottom lane, which is something that you begin to understand if you think about these concepts very critically and you watch a lot of the games within the region and not just the games of your favorite team. These small intricacies of the regional meta. So there's an encouragement if you're a personality or a figure in this specific region who's known for knowledge of ULCS, LPL, NALCS, etc., to watch a lot more of these games and watch them over and over again, which generally means that you have to give up games in another region for watching, and it's hard to just watch the best teams in every region, especially since the best teams move around a lot. And also, if you're a content creator who isn't a caster and you create content for a specific team in a region, you begin to build up a fan base, and fans of a team like TSM might have more of an attachment to a team like CLG or C9 or Immortals than they would to a team like G2, because they watch more NALCS, and even though their favorite team is TSM, they really are into the TSM-CLG rivalry, or they also kind of started watching C9 because they really liked the way C9 played when they saw them in a TSM match, and they got really into the player stories, and they really like Meteos and things like this. So you want to cater to an audience that you're already building, and the audience that you have existing for your TSM articles probably might be interested in hearing what you have to say about Cloud9 or Immortals more than they would about what you have to say about IMA, for example. So there are reasons why content creators across the board, not just casters, will tend to specialize in regions as well. So there are obvious benefits to this kind of region analysis during the regular season. You don't have a lot of international competition, so fans who really like NALCS or EULCS, and there tend to be more of those types of fans than ones who watch the top teams in a bunch of different regions because of time zones and other restrictions, that they want to know what you think about these teams, they want to know how these teams interact to you, and all of these other factors. So it's pretty easy at this time. The problem comes when international competition hits, and people who have really specialized in TSM, games, not TSM, in NALCS games might not really understand EULCS as well, or LPL as well, or LMS as well, or LCK as well, etc., etc. So they kind of have to play catch up and watch more games. And I think that there's definitely, like, you can definitely get a good baseline understanding for teams in other regions by watching a handful of their games, by watching their playoffs specifically. And so it's really not too bad if you're a specific regional analyst, and you could still have a lot of valuable things to say about these teams by watching a selection of their games. But if you have some more gaps, then you might overlook a few other things, or you might just have shorthand notes like, oh, okay, NA always does well here. Historically, you know, Carson has done super well or not super well at international events, so even if he's played really well in these playoffs, I'm skeptical about him, etc., because you have a limited base to base off of, and if you have to talk critically about these players, you might tend to just, like, kind of fluff a bit. So there are a few issues with that, but I do think generally people will have very valuable things to say if they're already smart and thinking about the game a lot. But the problem is, of course, that fans will tend to assume that a regional analyst will just be biased towards his region's teams. And there's a good reason to think that. Typically, when EU and LPL teams show up to international events, I personally want them to do well, even if, while I'm watching the region, I just do not like the way a team plays. Like, a good example would be last spring, Royal. I just, they drove me absolutely insane watching their games, like their Baron fixation, all these other things, and I was pretty critical of them when I wrote articles about them. But I wanted them to do well because it was like all of these hours I had spent agonizing over VODs of them just, like, screwing up here and there, and I wanted that time to be worth something. So it's just, if I would get into a discussion with someone who really liked NA, I would get, like, super passionate about what this team did wrong, you know? It was like, no, you don't understand, they're really bad here, and I wouldn't even know why I would be upset. It's just, these kinds of things are really interesting because you want this investment to pay off. So it makes sense to say that, okay, this guy, he watches more LPL than other regions, he probably is rooting for them and wants them to do well, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's biased towards LPL teams. In fact, if you spend a lot of time looking at a particular team in a region, you might over-tunnel on their flaws. For example, when people talk about Edward Gaming, I rated Edward Gaming lower than a lot of people internationally. I rated them third instead of second because I think about what they do when they have to play around top or play around mid, or when other teams play around top and mid, and they've struggled because the teams that they played in the regular season that were top focused were not that good. So if they face teams that are good and top focused, then I think that they might just fall apart. So I rate them much lower, even though I might be overlooking a flaw in Team Solo Mid, a team I rated higher, because I'm not as familiar with Team Solo Mid, but I might give them more of a benefit of the doubt because I haven't thought, like, as critically or as over and over and over and over again about the specific matchups they've had here, why they lost to Phoenix 1, why they lost to Equifox one game, as critically as I've thought about, okay, why are EDG losing to these bottom teams in the LPL, like losing small games to these bottom teams in the LPL. So I think that regional loyalty can actually create a negative bias that people haven't considered. So obviously, when I talk about a team that I'm really familiar with, like G2 or EDG at an international event, with a team that I'm not as familiar with, like Team Solo Mid, I've tried my best to watch every Team Solo Mid game this split, but I haven't quite made it, and even if I have, I've watched it like maybe once, each game maybe once, some of them at 2 times speed, so I'm still not spending nearly as much of my brain power on Team Solo Mid as I'm spending on G2 or EDG during the regular season. So when I talk about these teams facing up, I'm going to talk a lot more about, like, the exploitable weaknesses in G2 or EDG that Team Solo Mid can capitalize on, rather than some more of the details on Team Solo Mid, just naturally, because I'm more familiar with these teams. So this is something that you want to take with a grain of salt. Also, the big thing for me when we talk about regional loyalties is if you're an analyst of North American LCS or EU LCS and you watch an LPL or an LCK game, you might think that this thing that they're doing is really dumb. because you aren't used to teams doing this thing, but they've developed this for specific meta regions and reasons, and it might actually be better than what the NA and EU teams are doing, or vice versa. Again, an example that I used is like the fact that EU bot lanes don't necessarily start camps all the time, and I think this is very interesting because maybe they prioritize getting control of the minion wave or invading the enemy camp instead in certain situations. So I think that people are tending to overlook this. Like, for example, I think EDG's bot lane might have a weakness that hasn't been talked about a lot, which is that they are maybe one of the only bottom lanes in the LPL that understands that the first thing you do when you get to lane is you push the wave. A lot of the LPL teams will still just like play PvP, including RNG in particular. They'll just like attack the enemy champions, and they won't get control of the wave as easily as EDG's bot lane. So I feel like EDG's bot lane is just like getting boosted by how poorly some of these LPL bottom lanes play the laning phase. So I think it's really interesting because we might see that EDG's bottom lane turns out to not be that good, you know? Just these little tiny like aspects of the meta that I think are overlooked, and people ask, why is this team doing this? Like, why is it good or why is it bad? Edward Gaming and Royal Never Give Up and IMA and a bunch of LPL teams will try to just rush Baron at 20, and they won't have as good of a Baron setup. But if it's always going to be like this play for Baron at 20 minutes, it seems really risky, and the team that's ahead is willing to take that risk of losing the Baron because they feel like they're still going to be ahead anyway, even if they lose the Baron. But if they get it, they basically win the game off that, and this is definitely an LPL mindset. Maybe that isn't necessarily bad, right? Maybe that isn't necessarily terrible. Like, obviously they will lose some games off of that, but that willingness to just like go for the jugular on Baron can make them really powerful and really surprising sometimes as well, that I think is a little bit overlooked and just dismissed. So just these meta intricacies that people might not get because they're not familiar with not only the team that you're talking about, but the region as a whole. And a big interaction I think we're going to see is that a lot of Western teams, the jungle is still more about helping the lanes, whereas I feel like Chinese teams minus RNG, Korean teams, and LMS teams going to Worlds, the lanes are about helping the jungle. And talking to some of the Western teams like Mithy from G2, they're surprised by how effective the strategy is, right? So they might adapt to having their lanes play more about the jungle now, or it might change, right, as teams start playing like in these scrims more and more and more, etc., etc. So it's really hard to say how these metas will perfectly interact, but just overlooking a meta and dismissing it because you're not as familiar with the region is something that kind of drives me a little insane. I think these are all flaws or differences about regional loyalty that I think are important to look at and consider. Obviously, the benefits then are that it's really valuable to have multiple personalities on a desk or multiple people talking about these games and providing alternate opinions, because you have these very, very different baselines and these very different views of the game. Like, I might be more inclined to talk about some of these weird bot lane differences, or I might be more inclined to talk about Baron setups, etc., because I watch these regions that I watch the most. And people who watch the LCK might be more inclined to talk about how laners collapse around jugglers and things like this. So for me, this is really exciting because it creates a space where a lot of people's opinions are valuable, and there's a lot of good discourse and exchange that I'm just really enjoying taking in, without automatically assuming that someone who represents the LCK is just going to be biased towards the LCK, right? I'm not making this assumption at all. So I think, like, when people are presenting all of these different ideas, you can kind of grab something that you hadn't thought of, and you can measure it against something else you hadn't thought of. Like, if you really like a comment Jat makes about TSM, then you take that and you put it with a comment you really like about what Deficio says about G2, and you kind of compare, like, how these ideas kind of match up. What do you think is good? Like, having watched the games that you've watched, I think this is really, really cool because it allows fans to consider all of these ideas themselves, right? And not just take what an analyst says as fact, because all these analysts are going to have different opinions, and it doesn't make them wrong, it doesn't make them right, it just means that they have different parts of the picture. and you need to put them all together to really understand what's happening, or to really create an idea of your own. And maybe you're really smart about the game too as a spectator, and you just have really dug into watching the top teams of every region, and you really understand, feel like you understand G2 and TSM and Flash Wolves and all of these teams, and you can put them together really well, but you might not have seen, like a Caitlyn Rockhat game, and you might not understand like the impression that Caitlyn made on Europe as a whole, or all these like weird factors that come into play, or why this meta isn't doing it. So you can take that idea and you can add that to what you have as well. And there's just, I don't know, I just think it's really cool that we have these like regional loyalists to an extent coming to an event and having these discussions. I also think that when you get really caught up in understanding like small intricacies, or really breaking down how this player tends to play this champion at this level and all these other factors, or where this jungler decides to go at level 4, like how Trick will clear like a full side of the jungle in one go as Gragas or whatever, etc. If you get really invested into these ideas, and then someone who maybe watches 6 G2 games says something like, oh, well, Trick is ganking top and bot lane is overextending, so why are they doing this? Then it's like, I have no idea. That doesn't make any sense. They're completely out of sync. This is a big problem, etc., etc. So sometimes the Occam's razor approach, someone who isn't as invested into this team, can point out something you hadn't considered or hadn't thought of. Also something good, right? Not just something bad. Or maybe Clearlo does something at level 3 that he just does all the time, and you just assume that all junglers do that. And it's like, no, actually, this is pretty rare. The idea of someone who has this perspective on a different region that they bring to the table is really important. Like, maybe mid lane matchups might be more important to an NA analyst. So they talk more about that, and they have more thoughts on because TSM has this way of like infecting NA, and NA mids have like a really high percentage of gold, team gold on average compared to other laners, and talking about how mid lane affects the rest of the game is something that you can really gain from someone who's just like thought about this a lot more, because it's super important to NA, LCS, and all these other factors. So I think it's really cool that we're kind of able to have these conversations, and you can gain something from a bunch of different people. And it isn't just about being biased towards a certain player style, but ultimately, yes, you're going to get a bunch of different ideas, you're going to get a bunch of different perspectives, and I don't know, I feel kind of discouraged when people just say, this is bad because this person just watches this region. And of course, you've got the cool moments on the analyst desks for spectators who really can like root for their analysts. It's like, yeah, that's a good point, Spawn. Yeah, that's a good point, Jet. Yeah, awesome. Okay, I'm happy about this. And it's very exciting. So, my final thought is, don't just root for a team because it's a region that you've watched. Maybe you don't like that team that much, and you're really compelled by a storyline of a team from a region that you don't like as well. Like, the IMA storyline is super exciting. So maybe you're typically like an Immortals fan, and you're sad that Immortals didn't make it to Worlds, and you don't really have a team to root for. But the IMA or the Samsung story, like Ambition, like just finally making it to Worlds, is super exciting for you. You watch some Samsung games, you really like this team, but it's like, oh, the Western analysts are saying that I'm an NALCS fan, I should root for TSM. I don't like that. Like, if you like the way a team plays, play it. Like, if you're a big Splice fan, and you really like how Splice plays, right? Splice is pretty cool. They have these like really awesome comebacks and all these other stuff, but they don't play like G2 and H2K. If Splice fall out of the tournament and H2K and G2 make it past, I don't feel automatically compelled to root for G2 and H2K because they're EU teams. Like, IMA and CLG are more resourceful, kind of like Splice, and they play like this kind of scrappy style, so maybe if one of those teams makes it, like, root for them instead. Yeah, so don't take regional loyalty to as something that you have to have or something that you have to do, because maybe you really find out that you like something else. And that's why we watch esports, is because we find something that is exciting to us, right? And something that's really interesting. So you can be a regional loyalist and you can pursue the game from that perspective, but if there's something that really sparks your interest so that you want to just like dig into it, right, don't be afraid of that either. So yeah, thanks for watching, and kind of sort of consider some of these thoughts more before you just like start harping on someone because all he does is watch LCK, or before you start harping on someone because all he does is watch EU. Yeah, that's all. Thanks.